President McKinley was under great pressure to intervene on behalf of the beleaguered Cubans. American reporters like Stephen Crane wrote vivid accounts of suffering from Cuba, and the sensationalist journalism of publishers Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst in their newspapers described Spanish atrocities and fanned the flames for a free Cuba. In January, President McKinley sent the battleship Maine to Havana to stand by to evacuate American citizens from the riotous country. On February 15, the Maine was blown up, killing 260 American sailors. Hearst New York Journal, which offered a $50,000 reward, blamed Spanish agents for the disaster. Headlines inspired an outbreak of war fever in the country. As Americans flocked to recruiting stations with the cry, "Remember the Maine," Congress supported McKinley's ultimatum demanding Cuba's independence. Spain refused and declared war on the United States. Assistant Secretary of the Navy Teddy Roosevelt cabled Commodore Dewey in Hong Kong to sail for the Philippines, attack the main Spanish fleet in Manila Bay, prevent it from reaching Cuba. Dewey destroyed the Spanish fleet. In America, eager volunteers crowded into military training camps. Even that hater of war, William Jennings Bryan, enlisted in the National Guard. The U.S. Army of 28,000 men was long on enthusiasm and short on training. The country was so anxious to enter the war that we sent thousands of green volunteers to Cuba to fill out the ranks. Teddy Roosevelt resigned from the government and became an instant national hero when he led his famous Rough Riders up Kettle Hill, a battle called mistakenly in history books as San Juan Hill. Within 4 months, the United States easily defeated Spain, established Cuba's independence, and acquired a number of Spanish colonies, the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico. Spain signed a peace treaty protesting, "This demand strips us of a glorious past and expels us from the Western Hemisphere, which became civilized through the proud deeds of our ancestors." In an early film, Thomas Edison recreated the glorious war in the hills of New Jersey. It was all a great adventure to most Americans. Secretary of State John Hay wrote Teddy Roosevelt that it had been a splendid little war. By our decisive victory in this splendid little war, the United States served notice to the world that America was no longer a self-contained isolationist nation. During the 19th century, the expansion of the American empire from the Atlantic to the Pacific was called our manifest destiny. Our military interventions in the Caribbean and Central America during the early 20th century had been justified initially as the imperialism of righteousness. No matter what the euphemism or high-sounding phrase, for Latin Americans, our actions posed a threat to their sovereignty and supported their fears of the United States as a potential aggressor. Yankee phobia had become a deep-seated attitude that would be difficult to overcome in the period between the wars. Spanish-American War impressed President Teddy Roosevelt with the need to control Latin American affairs. 30 years later, Franklin Delano Roosevelt would successfully reverse the interventionist philosophy of his distant cousin. We're in the Monroe Room of the State Department, named after President James Monroe, father of a sacred national dogma which has guided American foreign policy since 1823, the Monroe Doctrine. Briefly stated, the doctrine warned European nations not to extend their political influence or their colonies in the Americas. Such an intrusion would be considered dangerous to our peace and safety. In 1904, Teddy Roosevelt brashly transformed the Monroe Doctrine from a policy condemning intervention by European powers to one condoning intervention by the United States. He viewed the U.S. as an international police force to correct, in his words, the wrongdoings of uncivilized nations. This policy was called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Teddy Roosevelt best summed up the real meaning when he said, "I've always been fond of the West African proverb, speak softly and carry a big stick. You will go far." Roosevelt's big stick pointed early on at Panama. He considered a transoceanic canal essential to commerce and national security. Colombia owned the Isthmus of Panama and rejected Roosevelt's offer to purchase the land. The frenetic Teddy was never one to accept a rebuff, particularly from a smaller neighbor.
Roosevelt said in unprintable language that the Colombians were not behaving in a proper fashion, and they were holding up the march of world civilization. So he determined that that would not be allowed to happen.
The building of the Panama Canal was a result of complicated intrigue. It is generally agreed that the United States inspired a revolution that brought independence to Panama. The regime immediately completed an arrangement with Teddy Roosevelt allowing the canal to be built. Roosevelt personally visited Panama, becoming the first American president to leave the country while in office. Of his devious methods, he later boasted, "I took the isthmus, started the canal, and then left Congress not to debate the canal, but to debate me." The excitement surrounding the opening of the Panama Canal obscured the chicanery involved in its acquisition. Built at a cost of $400 million, the price was even higher in diplomatic terms. Roosevelt's cowboy diplomacy created much ill will in Latin America and open hostility in Colombia. Roosevelt nevertheless considered the Panama Canal his greatest accomplishment in foreign affairs.
In Roosevelt's terms, in the context of his age, he behaved in a morally justifiable manner. Today, we'd have trouble with that kind of behavior, and I think most of us would agree that it was at best shady, and that it probably would violate the rules of the game by which we think the United States plays today. 70 years ago, Roosevelt was behaving the way other nations behaved, so in that sense, historical perspective is necessary.
When Woodrow Wilson became president in 1913, his most pressing foreign policy problem was Mexico's revolution. A 30-year dictatorship was under attack for its oppression of Mexico's 15 million landless, poverty-stricken peasants. The revolution was led by a young reformer, Francisco Madero, who wanted to end foreign privileges and give Mexico back to the Mexicans. The revolution succeeded, but Madero was betrayed by his leading general, Victoriano Huerta, who led a military coup. Madero was murdered in prison. Huerta proclaimed himself president of Mexico. Huerta was supported by the Mexican aristocracy and wealthy foreign investors who financed his regime, many of them American. William Randolph Hearst owned land there reportedly the size of Rhode Island. Mexico's copper and silver mines attracted heavy American investment. President Wilson, against the advice of his cabinet, refused to recognize the Huerta regime, calling it a government of butchers. Wilson alone determined to intervene in Mexico and used the arrest of a few American sailors as an excuse. Wilson sent Marines to Veracruz. Besides humiliating Huerta, Wilson made arms available to Carranza and Pancho Villa, who overthrew Huerta.
So in Mexico, Wilson is trying to be a school teacher, and he's got a very recalcitrant child. And that language, I think, is instructive in understanding what you refer to as the moral tone of Wilson's policy. Mexico to Wilson was a child to be educated in the benefits of truth and beauty.
The United States recognized the regime of Carranza, a socialist who believed in reform, but Carranza did not act quickly enough for two of his followers, Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata. Pancho Villa staged a raid on the border town of Columbus, New Mexico in March 1916, killing 17 Americans and burning the town. Villa had two goals: one, to involve his rival Carranza in a war with America; second, to dramatize his contempt for foreigners. President Wilson again sent American troops into Mexico, this time to pursue Pancho Villa's raiders. The American punitive expedition was under the command of General John Pershing. Villa proved as elusive as a scarlet pimpernel, constantly provoking the Americans with skirmishes and demonstrating how ill-prepared they were for war. As the expedition penetrated deeper into Mexico, American troops clashed with Mexican federal troops. Villa had succeeded. Wilson had averted war against Carranza's army, principally because Pershing's forces were needed for America's entry into Europe's war.
The broadened concept of national security that comes out of the First World War, our preoccupation with means of communication, with fuel and petroleum, with bank loans, with finance capital, in other words, provide other means for interaction with and potential control over other nations. In a sense, then, the private sector becomes an agency of the nation itself. And there is an interweaving of economic activity and government interest, which is very hard to separate.
Peace, prosperity, and a reliance on dollar-based diplomacy eased the tensions between the U.S. and her Latin American neighbors. In 1921, dedication ceremonies in New York City honoring Simon Bolivar symbolized improved relations under President Harding. With Senate approval, Harding ordered a $25 million payment to Colombia, long-delayed compensation for Roosevelt's acquisition of the Panama Canal, a proposal first made by Woodrow Wilson. Good intentions notwithstanding, American troops were a visible presence protecting U.S. interests and keeping order in at least 4 Latin American countries. In 1925, President Calvin Coolidge pulled U.S. troops out of Nicaragua, but a new revolt soon broke out. Nicaragua, the classic banana republic, had been an American protectorate since 1912. Its location at the heart of the Isthmus of Central America made it of strategic importance to the U.S. In 1927, rebel insurgents supplied with arms from Mexico started another revolution. Secretary of State Frank Kellogg accused Mexico of planning a communist takeover of Nicaragua. He sent in 5,000 Marines to protect American lives and property. The president finally sent former Secretary of War Henry Stimson to Nicaragua to clean up the mess, in his words, and mediate a truce. With a force of troops behind him, Stimson persuaded both sides to lay down their weapons and submit to an American-supervised election. As stability returned to Nicaragua, a major crisis was developing in Mexico. American border towns were overrun by Mexican refugees fleeing the edicts of President Plutarco Calles. An iron-willed reformer, Calles launched violent attacks on the Catholic Church and foreign landowners. He deported priests, closed church schools and convents. Calles expropriated American oil holdings and threatened to return all oil and mineral rights to Mexican ownership. American oil companies demanded armed intervention. Calvin Coolidge appointed his former Amherst College classmate, Dwight Morrow, ambassador to Mexico. For Morrow, a successful businessman unschooled in diplomacy, the instructions were, keep us out of war. Morrow's son-in-law happened to be Charles Lindbergh, already an international hero. Lucky Lindy, at Morrow's request, flew non-stop from Washington to Mexico City. With Lindbergh on the scene, Morrow fashioned the beginnings of the solution of the crisis. Morrow's sense of tact in his friendly approach produced immediate results. Morrow persuaded Caius to slow down his land seizure program and end his violent anti-Catholic crusade. He established a solid friendship with President Caius, meeting him frequently on a face-to-face basis, even giving him a ride in Lindbergh's airplane. After Lindbergh left, the oil companies were partially compensated and relations were vastly improved.
By the end of the 20s, you have a growing conviction that the United States cannot, and some even say ought not, to teach democracy to nations in the hemisphere if they don't want to learn, nor to force American-style economic development on them if they don't want it. And this is the beginning of what we later call the good neighbor policy.
The origin of the good neighbor policy can be traced to the 7-week goodwill tour of President-elect Herbert Hoover in November of 1928. Hoover repudiated the detested Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which justified intervention. During his administration, 50 revolutions took place in Latin America, but the United States did not intervene in any of them. In fact, Hoover actually withdrew American troops from Latin America, saying, "I have no desire for representation abroad through our military forces." Hoover acted in good faith and kept his word. As this 1930 cartoon implies, he was greatly appreciated in Latin America. During Hoover's administration, however, the Depression tarnished much of the effect of his liberal policies toward Latin American internal affairs. Our relations with our neighbors grew worse because American protective tariffs, economic nationalism, closed U.S. markets to Latin American trade. Once again, we incurred the hostility of the countries south of our border. Hoover's successor, Franklin Roosevelt, formalized the good neighbor policy and made it seem to be his own.
In the field of world policy, I would dedicate this nation to the policy of the good neighbor.
In his inaugural address, FDR baptized, publicized, and glamorized the words, good neighbor.
The neighbor who resolutely respects himself, and because he does so, respects the rights of others.
Secretary of State Cordell Hull said pessimistically, our inheritance of ill will was grim. FDR and Hull improved relations with Panama by renegotiating the Panama Canal Treaty. The new treaty gave Panama commercial rights in the canal zone, but did not resolve the sovereignty question. The treaty was signed in 1936, but was not approved by the Senate until 1939, when Panama finally agreed to allow the United States to defend the canal in emergencies. The turning point for the good neighbor policy came in December 1933 at the Montevideo Conference. Secretary of State Cordell Hull was committed to the principle of non-intervention. Aware of Latin American distrust, he convinced America's most belligerent antagonist, Argentina, and her foreign minister, Saavedra Lamas, to introduce a non-intervention resolution which declared no state has the right to intervene in the affairs of another. Hull seconded the resolution. Saavedra Lamas later won the Nobel Peace Prize. Many thought the adroit Hull really deserved it for inspiring the Lamas proposal. Argentina, with a large German population, had become increasingly sympathetic to Hitler's Nazi regime. Hostility towards America had long smoldered over U.S. trade policies. Argentina's main exports, grain and beef, were not allowed into the United States. The country turned toward European markets, Italy, Spain, Germany, and was ripe for fascist and Nazi infiltration. The German community held tightly to its links with the fatherland. The pervasive influence of Nazism in Latin America deeply concerned the Roosevelt administration, particularly in Argentina. November 1936, FDR endures a 7,000-mile, two-week trip at sea to attend his special conference for peace in Buenos Aires. Roosevelt reaffirmed our commitment to non-intervention and called for continental solidarity to face the threat of war in Europe.
This is no conference to form alliances, to partition countries, to deal with human beings as though they were pawns in a game of chance. Our purpose, under happy auspices, is to secure the continuance of the blessings of peace. Beyond the ocean, we see continents rent asunder by old hatreds and new fanaticisms. Can we, the republics of the New World, help the Old World to avert the catastrophe that impends? Yes, I am confident that we can.
The accomplishments of Buenos Aires were even celebrated in song.
We understand that the president had just been on a visit to Brazil and the Argentine, with Mr. Cordell Hull in attendance, where they took part in a peace conference to stop war and atrocity and make the world safe for democracy, the greatest event of the century in the interest of suffering humanity.
Cynics have argued that the good neighbor policy is nothing but a form of the United States protecting itself from potential enemies in the hemisphere. And indeed, there may be an element of that, of very self-interested policy lying behind the good neighbor attitude. But there is no doubt, in my mind at least, that the United States did succeed in winning the friendship of many countries in Latin America as a result of the good neighbor policy.
The hemisphere drew even closer together at the Lima Conference of '38, after France and Britain gave Czechoslovakia to Hitler at Munich.
But there must not be a shadow of a doubt anywhere as to the determination of the American nations not to permit the invasion of their hemisphere by the armed forces of any power or any possible combination of powers. Let no one doubt for a moment that so long as the possibility of armed challenge exists, the United States will maintain adequate defensive military, naval, and air establishment.
We are working together, 21 republics, in a friendly spirit, in understanding, with a desire to really accomplish a permanent solidarity.
The threat of war in Europe had drawn us closer together than ever before. From Hitler's occupation of the Rhineland in 1936 to the Munich crisis of '38, we edged slowly toward greater unity and cooperation. Finally, after the Second World War began in Europe, we achieved hemispheric solidarity, Argentina excepted. It came because of a threat from outside, Nazi aggression in Europe. In all the years before, we could not achieve it ourselves. That demonstrates the difficulty of getting immediate results in foreign affairs. Each accomplishment is an evolutionary process building on what came before.